The year was 1969. John Lennon had released 3 experimental solo albums. Paul McCartney was preparing to record his first solo project that same year. The Beatles were arguably one of the biggest bands around. In September, John Lennon walked into Abbey Road Studios in London, England. As Paul was developing new guitar playing techniques, John told him, "I am leaving." And with those words ended one of the most prolific songwriting duos in music history. It wouldn't be until April of the next year that the unwashed masses would learn the fate of the Beatles. 10 years later, in the winter of 1980, Lennon and McCartney were still legendary names in the music industry. One night, on his way home from a nice steak dinner with his good friend Yoko Ono, John Lennon was gunned down in front of his New York home, leaving the world devastated and his family homeless. Halfway across the world, ex-Beatle Paul McCartney learned of his friend's passing and immediately began work on a tribute. This project would go on to become one of the most moving albums ever recorded. This is the untold story of Spies Like Us. Production got off to a rocky start. In addition to losing his best friend, McCartney lost the keys to his house, forcing the writing process to begin right there on McCartney's front lawn. In typical McCartney fashion, Paul began with an idea. More on that later. As the story goes, the drum beat was inspired by the sound of Paul repeatedly slamming his fist into his front door. This rhythm would become the foundation of the title track. With percussion set in stone, Paul proceeded to go through over 20 different sets of lyrics, each completely different from the set that preceded it. It wasn't long before he reached a creative block. Paul knew he wouldn't get far without enlisting the help of legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios. Martin and McCartney had known each other for over 5 years, and if anyone knew how to concentrate McCartney's raw, untamed emotions, it was legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios. Since McCartney had tenure at Abbey Road, the label granted him 8 consecutive months of uninterrupted recording time. For the first 6 weeks, McCartney simply sat on the floor. It was during this period that Paul infamously cooked and ate the guitar on which Blackbird was written and recorded. Since Paul and his wife Linda were strict vegetarians, this act of defiance would only serve to drive a wedge between the two during this period of his career. After 6 weeks of sitting down, Paul finally stood up to get a can of Fresca. He immediately fell down as a result of having not used his legs for well over a month. He slammed his head into the corner of a nearby amplifier, leaving a nasty dent in the side of his head, as Paul recalled in a 1996 interview with Vogue.
"I was lying there on the floor. I remember I was unconscious and losing blood fast. I had locked the doors, so all George could do was watch in horror from the inside of the control room as I twitched on the floor. As my brain blood leaked onto the filthy studio carpet, God came to me in a vision. I saw him sitting there, a banjo in his hands. He looked at me as he played a beautiful melody on it. I asked him what song he was playing, and he said, 'You like it? You can have it.' To this day, I still don't know what it all meant."
Things didn't look good, but luckily for Paul, legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios was able to smash the window in the control room with one of the Beatles' Grammy Awards. Paul was rushed to the hospital where silly British doctors were able to save his life. Paul remained in a coma for 6 months, during which he managed to perfect the fine details of what would become Spies Like Us. When Paul awoke from his coma, he went straight to Abbey Road Studios, where legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios was waiting for him. The pair went to work immediately and managed to lay down rough versions of an album's worth of material in just one day. Over the course of the next 3 days, Paul made more progress than he had in the past year. But on the 3rd day, Paul finally hit another roadblock. Despite his efforts, he and legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios felt that the keyboard part just wasn't right. At his wit's end, Paul requested the help of 2 artists, legendary session keyboardist Chevy Chase and Dan Aykroyd, who had recently skyrocketed into superstardom after his contribution to We Are the World. Chase was the first to arrive, along with his famous keyboard, Melinda, nicknamed after his late wife, Melinda Chase. Dan Aykroyd wasn't far behind, arriving in full conehead costume and prosthetics. Aykroyd had assumed McCartney would appreciate the gesture, but he couldn't have been more wrong. McCartney considered this gesture rude and unprofessional. To this day, Abbey Road upholds a strict no conehead policy. Legend has it that during a heated debate over Aykroyd's attire, Chase whipped out Melinda and began playing the famous keyboard melody that the world would learn to love. McCartney immediately dropped the dispute and began to sing to Chase's playing. The demo which came from this initial session is said to have lasted over 80 minutes. Once everything was down to tape, Aykroyd had a few suggestions. The first was to remove the profanity that riddled the current version of the lyrics. McCartney agreed, but Aykroyd's second suggestion was met with resistance. At this point in production, the track was titled Go Fuck Yourself, and McCartney intended this to be the name of the album as well. Aykroyd insisted the track be renamed Spies Like Us, in reference to a line from the song's chorus. McCartney argued that renaming the track would debase the lyrics and confuse his audience, but after a week of arguing, McCartney relented, famously saying,
"All right."
One day, legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios became frustrated with the numerous changes being made to the song and tried to barge into the studio with the intent of killing one of the musicians. Unfortunately for legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios, the trio managed to lock the door to the recording space. It was at this moment that legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios took a photograph of the musicians through the keyhole of the door in order to prove just how naughty those boys were being. But they didn't care, they didn't give a fuck. When executives saw the photograph, they thought it would be the perfect image for the cover of the album. In fact, they liked the picture so much that they extended McCartney's deadline by 4 years. Exhausted from all their work, McCartney, Aykroyd, and Chase decided to go on a paid 2-year break from recording. After some well-deserved R&R, the three amigos reunited at Abbey Road Studios in London, England, only to find the band 9 Inch Nails in their recording space. In their extended absence, label executives had assumed McCartney & Co. had finished recording and had allowed other artists to record in the studio. The two groups were forced to share the space. This is evident in the final version of Spies Like Us, in which you can hear Trent Reznor exclaim the word decoys. Decoys! Now, with McCartney's trademark vocals, McCartney's signature bass playing, and McCartney's unique drumming, the album was nearly finished. Unfortunately, disaster struck on the night of August 25, 1983, when a gang of rugby hooligans broke into Abbey Road Studios with a rugby ball and began erasing every tape they could find. But what the children didn't know was that 2-time Grammy winner Paul McCartney had been sleeping in the studio. McCartney surprised the boys by firing at them with a handgun. According to McCartney, he was able to hit one of the kids, but in the end, they all got away. Although he was able to fend the little bastards off, the damage was done. Over 3 years of hard work had been destroyed in the blink of an eye, but not all was lost. The hooligans had time to erase all but one song. That final song was Spies Like Us. Right then, McCartney knew the LP had to be comprised of 3 different versions of that song. This was a radical new idea, as at that point in the 1980s, albums normally consisted of several different songs which varied in tone, rhythm, and tempo. An album made up of 3 versions of the same song was a game-changing concept, and it was one that legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios was strongly opposed to. As legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios recalled in a 1996 interview with Vogue,
"I told Paul, that's not an album, that's a 12-inch single."
After over 15 minutes of heated discussion, legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios quit. It would be 8 long years before he produced another project. In the absence of legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios, McCartney took on production duties. Without the constraints of a heavily experienced and skilled producer, McCartney was free to carry on with the freedom to do whatever he wanted. His vision for the album consisted of 3 wildly different versions of the song Spies Like Us. One version would be intended for fun events, such as parties and soirees. Paul would eventually christen this version the Party Mix. Paul also conceived of a version he dubbed the Alternative Mix. This version had a much more abrasive, biting sound inspired by the hardcore punk movement of the early 80s. Paul's third and final idea was the DJ version. The intent behind this particular version was to have a version of Spies Like Us that listeners could take home and mix themselves, creating a groundbreakingly immersive musical experience for fans. With the recording done, the end was finally in sight. Paul spent the next 168 hours mixing the tracks, never stopping for food or sleep. During that time, no one else was allowed in the studio, not even collaborators Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase, who wanted desperately to give their input. Paul spent days moving sliders and turning knobs, nearly going insane from the mental energy required to perform these tasks. Paul peed his pants. On the 7th day, cocaine addict Harry Nilsson managed to throw himself through several locked doors to get into the studio because he thought he'd left his lighter in the control room. Exhausted and impressed by Nilsson's strong work ethic, McCartney decided to allow him to hear the current version of the Spies Like Us LP. Nilsson was impressed, but had one suggestion. As Nilsson recalled in a 1996 interview with Vogue,
I told Paul, "You know that song My Carnival you recorded with Wings? You should put that on here. I think that would be pretty funny."
But McCartney wasn't laughing. In fact, he thought it was perfect. After hastily ripping My Carnival from a cassette and slapping it on the master tape, McCartney was ready to release it to the common people. With the A-side of the LP comprised of 2 versions of Spies Like Us, and the B-side rounded out with yet another version of Spies Like Us, as well as My Carnival, Paul felt that he'd finally created both his magnum opus and the perfect goodbye to his late friend John Lennon. The LP is defined by the heartbreak and loss present in the performances, perhaps best exemplified in the intro to the alternative mix. But it isn't all doom and gloom. Paul seems to have come to terms with the loss of his best buddy in My Carnival. This track presents a sort of sonic rainbow following the storm of pain and anger presented in the first 3 tracks. It was time to celebrate. 5 years of hard work had culminated in Paul's masterpiece. With no regrets in mind, Paul received a shock the night of the release. He was told that all 11 tracks which he'd thought to have been erased by the rugby hooligans had resurfaced. Unbeknownst to Paul, a number of copies had been made of those tracks, just in case the originals were erased by a gang of naughty children. This was great news, but unfortunately, Paul had pressed the go button just moments before, rendering this information useless. The album was a critical darling upon release, with Rolling Stone magazine giving the album a 7 out of 10. After hearing the LP, legendary producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios stated,
That's more or less how I would have done it.
Although Spies Like Us only reached number 7 on the Billboard charts, it became revered as a classic in the following decades. The alternative mix went on to catalyze the alternative rock movement of the 1990s, with legendary musicians such as Tom York and Billy Corgan calling it their favorite song. The DJ mix also created the term DJ and is still heard in clubs all around the world to this day. A movie was also made based around the making of the album, starring none other than actors Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase. If you're interested in learning more about Paul McCartney's numerous contributions to music, I'd suggest checking out this episode's sponsor, Sockbox. Sockbox is your one-stop shop for all things socks. With as many as 1 pair of socks delivered right to your door every month, there's no reason to go sock shopping ever again. I often wear their socks when I'm out in the pool or just jerking off. Go to sockbox.com/gofuckyourself or text I'm retarded to 911 to start kissing my ass today. Fuck this.